Ladies and gentlemen, today we're thrilled to have a special guest with us, Mr. R.K. Sawyer. Rob is a passionate waterfowl hunting enthusiast, author, and has managed multiple duck clubs. He is the author of several books on the history of waterfowl hunting in Texas, including 100 Years of Texas Waterfowling History, Texas Market Hunting, Waterfowl Game Laws and Outlaws, and Images of the Hunt, a photographic history of Texas waterfowling. We're excited to have Rob on the show to share his insights and experiences as a dedicated waterfowl hunter and an advocate for wildlife conservation. Please join us in welcoming Rob to the Fowl Minds podcast. Rob, welcome to the Fowl Minds podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here, gentlemen.
The way that we usually start this off is by asking about your first duck hunt. If you could share a story on that, that'd be awesome.
You know, it's funny, a lot of the duck hunts merge together, but that one stays with me forever. And I think about it often. Chesapeake Bay, I guess I was 10 years old and had a boat that I hauled over to a cove off the Miles River, which was off the Chesapeake Bay. And then I had to ride my bicycle, 20 miles in the snow. Had to ride a bicycle to get there, and had a light on it and baskets. And I had put out, I could afford 8 Victor plastic decoys. And I read, because no one taught me. There really wasn't a lot of people around in those days, or at least in that area. And Outdoor Life magazine showed this classic J spread. So I put these 8 decoys in a J spread in a cove, sat down on a shoreline, never thought about wing shooting a bird. So I had a good view of the decoys, but a tree covering me over. One single black duck came in and landed in those Victor decoys, and I took a bolt action 16 gauge and took my shot, and red legs were up after that, and I carried that first black duck home rather proudly in the basket of that bicycle.
That's awesome.
Pretty primitive beginnings, but I imagine an awful lot of people started about the same way.
You were hooked after that then, huh?
I was hooked before it, during it, and after it.
So yeah, that's kind of a similar story for me. So you said you started in the Chesapeake Bay. I know a little bit of the story, but for those listening that don't, you live in Texas now, but you're not a native Texan. So you didn't start out a Texan, but you got here as quick as you could. Is that the?
No, I took the slow route here. Chesapeake Bay to Florida to Louisiana, and then Texas about, probably 30 some years ago now.
That's awesome. So I would say in the waterfowl community, you're best known for the books that you've authored. And I know there's 3 that are on the internet that are more well known, but out of curiosity, what got you interested in writing about Texas waterfowling?
So, what I really wanted to do was read about it. I didn't want to write a thing. When I was in New Orleans, when I was in even Florida, and of course the Chesapeake Bay, all the places I hunted, in those days you didn't have the internet. You didn't have any way to learn about anything if you chose to learn, other than talking to people and buying magazines and books. So on the Chesapeake, I must have had a library of 10, 15 books on waterfowl hunting. So when I moved to Texas, what I wanted to do was read. I wanted to read about Texas waterfowl hunting. And I was shocked to learn that other than great outdoor writers, newspapers, a couple magazines, there were no books on Texas waterfowl hunting. And originally what I tried to do was convince somebody else to write them, because I didn't want to do it. I wasn't a writer, and I had a job and a duck club, and finally I gave up and said, I'm going to do this thing. And A&M Press, it was interesting. A&M Press reaction was, we've been trying to get somebody to write something about Texas waterfowl hunting for 20 years. So the victim came along at the right time.
So that, I guess so that's one thing that I didn't think about before this. The relationship with A&M there. How could you talk a little bit more about that? I just noticed it on the spine of one of your books, or a couple of them. There's that A&M logo there. But
Yes, there's 4 books total about waterfowl hunting, and A&M Press was took the risk. Unknown writer. I mean, I didn't even know if I could write a sentence. Neither did they, but they took the risk and they put out the first 2 books. One's called 100 Years of Texas Waterfowl Hunting, and that one's about decoys and guides and places. And the other one's Texas Market Hunting. So those are the 2 really historical books. Along the way, I collected something like I collected 600 and some photos. About 400 were good, and I like the old photos. So about a decade later, I put out a book called coffee table book called Images of the Hunt, and that one, very little writing. It's just all pictures. And then a gentleman contacted me named Jim Maloney and said, "Look, you're the only person that seems to know anything about this fancy hunting club from the late 1890s that was the world's most expensive hunting club, the world's most impressive hunting club, that was built on St. Joseph's Island and survived from 1897 to 1904." And he said, "You think, would you write a book about it?" And so that became the last book, came out last year, called The Tarpon Club and the Genius of E.H.R. Green.
I haven't bought that one yet, so I'm gonna have to. Is that one's available to buy online as well?
It is, but I tell you what, just send me a note and I'll send it to you.
Okay, awesome, cool. Well, one of my favorite stories involving Rob is one. It's became one of my favorite stories to tell in recent years. And it's a story about how Rob and I met. So I'll share that now. I think I've told this. Hayden's probably had to hear it 10 times through me telling other friends of ours while we're hunting. So my girlfriend and I were at mutual friend of Rob and I's, Corey Bauman of Bauman Propellers, and he had told me a lot about Rob in the past, and we were, about some of his books, and I believe the Images of the Hunt had just came out, but he brought Rob's books out, and one of the books that we looked at was the Texas market hunting book. And Rebecca's sitting next to me, and her eye, it's just like female that doesn't care about duck hunting. Her eyes just kind of glaze over, right? But one thing she took from it was Corey and I's interest in books about waterfowl hunting. And so the following day, she came back to me with kind of a printout of a picture of the cover of Rob's book that we had looked at and some notes. And she was just like, didn't even catch on that was the book we had looked at the day before. And she's like, "Hey, so A&M had written a book about waterfowling, and my 3rd grade grandfather was on the cover." And then so she actually have it right here, but so she's like, "That's," and I was like, "Rebecca, I was like, A&M didn't write the book." I was like, "Rob wrote it. We were just looking at these books last night." And she's like, "Oh, really?" And I was like, "Yeah, it showed how much you were paying attention, right?" But it was cool. I mean, how much of a blessing to not only have, your family written about in the book, but be on the cover. And then just such a weird coincidence that, a close friend of Rob and I's, had connected us. And so that's one of my favorite stories to tell. Pretty cool. So the topic of the 3 books, would you say that it seems like to me that they were all, you kind of researched most of them together in a certain way, or did you kind of go off and before you wrote all of them, was this separate research that you did?
Well, I set out to do the market book. My neighbor on the Chesapeake Bay was a gentleman by the name of Harry Walsh, and he wrote a book that I've waterfowl hunted all over the world, and I find that book all over the world. Outlaw Gunner by Harry Walsh, which first introduced sink boxes and punt guns. I set out to write that book. but I get distracted easily. So I ended up with, I think A&M had given me a contract for one book with everything for 60,000 words. And I think I had something like 130,000 words just from Jefferson County. Um, there's a lot of information. So patient they were, they said, okay, we'll expand your first contract, and all right, we'll give you 2 contracts. You can split the topic up into market gunning and sport hunting, if you will. But yes, it was about 4 to 5 years where it was solid interviews, solid research that spawned all 3 books.
Okay. So if you could give us a like single most interesting fact about doing the research for the books, what would that be?
Well, that's it's tough to pick from, I think in the end, 300,000 words, but I thought about that a lot. And I think the thing that had the biggest impression on me was when I came to Texas, it was an awfully good goose hunting area. Duck hunting was still good. But when you arrive at an area, you put a filter on it. I think wherever you go, this is what it's like. So for me, it was learning that Texas had a world-class canvasback population. We had eelgrass, just like the Susquehanna Flats on the Chesapeake. The distribution, the numbers of canvasbacks were huge. In fact, Rebecca's great-great-grandfather's property, the Whitehead Ranch, that was on the northwest side of Lake Surprise, which was probably the #1 canvasback spot in Texas, one of the best in the nation. Other big surprise for me was the number of, I still use the old term, greater Canada geese. These big whopping Canadas were all over Texas. It surprised me that there were swans from the Sabine River all the way down to the Rio Grande River. We don't see many swans anymore. And as a goose hunter, I love taking blue geese, but blue geese were extraordinarily rare. They were, I think, Atwater. Atwater is, we've named the southern version of the prairie chicken for him. He tried to find a blue goose in Texas for 20 years and found one. They didn't get to Texas until the 1940s, which again surprised me. So I'd say that for me, the biggest deal, the biggest thing that I learned was the tremendous volume of birds and the changes in the birds over time.
That's awesome. This makes me think about Hayden a little bit, because I remember you had sent the audio files that when you were interviewing Joe Whitehead, and you pointed this out, but that he was like, yeah, I shot a ringneck, and I'm like, he's like, yeah, and I had to. This ringneck was so big and I was so small. I got my 410 and I had to drag it back to the house, and I'm like, what? Like, why would you have to drag a ringneck back to the house? And then, so that was what they called Canada geese back then, right?
Ringneck.
Yes, it was. Yes, and you heard that name right up until, I'd say, I don't know, Hayden, you may still hear it, but I was hearing that name for them by old timers right up until maybe the first years that I got here.
I haven't, the first time I was ever around big Canada geese was 10 years ago when I went to Kansas. I'd never seen one before, but up until I got a good job, real job, I couldn't afford to go hunt out of state,
Right.
And that was the first time I'd ever seen them. And they're cool, but I don't like cleaning them. But you mentioned canvasbacks. I listened to a podcast. I don't remember when it was. I was driving to our duck club in Mississippi. It's in the Mississippi Delta, and I was driving up there. It's an 8-hour drive for me, so I listened to 3 or 4 podcasts, and it was about market hunting. And I'm pretty sure it was with Ramsey Russell, and he talked about the canvasback being the prized bird, back then, shipping them up to New York restaurants and stuff like that. And I was going to ask you, whenever you were writing this book, did they talk about any type of decline back then in canvasback numbers, since everybody was targeting that, that species because they were just so prolific and brought so much money in those restaurants?
So great question. Probably so there was a massive decline. Canvasbacks were first shot for the New York markets, and they were shot out of Long Island. They wiped those out. Let's say that's the wrong terminology. They put so much pressure on them that they continued moving south. Chesapeake Bay, so much pressure they started moving down to the Currituck Sound in North Carolina. Those poor cans had a ton of pressure on them. Then 1880s, the marketplace discovered Texas. We put enormous pressure on them, 1880s through 1890s. But what's interesting is that Texas made it illegal to not so much to market hunt, but to sell birds and to sell birds across state lines as early as 1903.
Wow.
Remember, the first real legislation out of the federal government wasn't until 1918. So Texas probably would have felt the pressure on their birds, particularly the canvasback, had it gone on another 15 years. But legal market hunting was shut down. So yeah, plenty of outlaw gunning, but not volumetrically as significant as what it was when it was legal. What actually wiped the canvasbacks out was same thing as Susquehanna Flats mostly, and that was changes in salinity. So on the Chesapeake, they dug a big old canal that brought salt water into the Susquehanna Flats from the Atlantic Ocean, killed all the eelgrass. If you look at Lake Surprise, that monster hurricane of 1900 killed all the eelgrass. Joe Whitehead said some of it came back, but never the amount that came back before. So never, not a simple answer, Hayden, but a great question.
Yeah, that's
So
one thing.
the eelgrass, I know you know a little bit about habitat management. I've been reading a little bit about it recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but eelgrass, it can live in brackish water, but not like a super high salinity water. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a fussy plant, but boy, the ducks love it.
Yeah. That's interested me because there's a reservoir I like to go hunt out in West Texas. It's just in the middle of the barren desert. And some years, depending on the lake level, I think the ducks have plenty of food. And there's tons of birds on this. They don't see any pressure. Hardly any, let's say. They see me. But, just as an example, went out there on a trip with the boat and the bus back here it was in November, the end of November after Thanksgiving, I want to say. And then lots of ducks, but we hunted them, didn't see any other hunter there. Now, they were feeding on some type of grass in the bottom of the lake, but the biggest issue I would say with the lake, besides the fact that it's in the desert, is that there's quite a bit of it has pretty high salinity for a freshwater lake. In fact, most of the research you can find on it is related to the intake of salt water into Lake Amistad and how that's kind of became an issue. But I can't remember how many parts per million they see in that reservoir, and I don't know that if it has something to do with the oil and gas stuff or more with the potash mines that the Pecos River runs through north of like the border, let's say, along the Pecos River. But anyways, yeah, it interested me because I think it holds a lot of ducks, but it's pretty barren for food. So that's it made me kind of wonder if that would be something to plan in there. But I guess I'm kind of digressing a little bit here on that topic. But no, I guess the next question I have for you is on the research of the books. Now, I'm a pretty bad host because I've read tidbits of your book, but I haven't read your books completely. So I'll have to have you back on after I complete those reading them.
I haven't read them myself, so I'm with you.
Well, so the ones that I did read related to Addison, I know it was like he would there were stories of him shooting 40 mallards, and then there were stories of him shooting 60. And then my understanding was that he wouldn't shoot more than 40 because he would start getting stuck in the marsh, and his horse would start getting stuck in the marsh and he couldn't get him out. And I thought that was pretty awesome. So I was, out of all that, I'm sure you read, all the research you did and people you interviewed, there's got to be some incredible hunting stories that in today's, with today's population, let's say, that we just couldn't even fathom. So could you share a story on what would you like, one of the most compelling hunting stories that you ran across while doing the research?
Yeah, you bet. I thought about that question because I figured you might ask it. And you've got all the thousands of ducks that were harvested by market gunners, sport hunters. It was not unusual. There used to be a marvelous, so the Coleman Fulton Ranch, Rockport area, put in a cattle pond. They put a levee up over a creek and flooded fresh water next to Aransas Bay. And that was the first really large freshwater available in a mostly sailing area. And it became a world-class gunning area. Mark Twain hunted there, a couple presidents, and the sports would just stand on this levee that they put up for cattle, and they shot about 1,000 ducks a day. So numerically, Texas was special. If you read the old 1880s New York magazines, where all the great outdoor magazines came from in those days, they called Texas such things as the greatest discovery of the century. That wasn't just hyperbole, but my favorite story has nothing to do with any of that. It's one that if I hadn't trusted the source and had it confirmed, I struggled with it. And that was 1920s. There was a guide who started off in a place called Harbor Island, Port Aransas area, Aransas Pass, a world-class, spectacular gunning area. That was one of the 3 really big canvasback spots in Texas. But 1920s, lots of redheads, lots of pintails, and he starts a guiding business. Just after World War II, he got dozens of blinds. He's known for miles of shoreline that every guide let him have. He owned it and got no ducks. So he's got all his clients that he's built up, and he's got no ducks. So he cancels all his hunts. So the story goes from his grandson, and who I interviewed about a decade ago, took his kids to a football game in Aransas Pass, and it starts raining. A norther blows in. While they're playing the football game in the rain and the wind, ducks are attracted to lights. Now, remember, in those days, our little tiny Texas coastal towns didn't have a lot of lights, and they were attracted to these lights and started flying lower and lower and below the lights. Finally, facing that north wind, they started landing on the football field, exhausted. They had to cancel the football game. And I was able to verify it in a newspaper, they canceled the game, quote unquote, because of the number of redheads and pintails that had landed between the goalposts.
Wow.
Now think about a Texas where you don't have a lot of lights. You got your first stadium lights, and you cancel a football game because your field's covered in ducks. It doesn't happen often.
Wow.
That's crazy.
That's a crazy story. Huh. Yeah, they must have been exhausted, like you said, huh?
Yeah, see, fallout used to be a very real thing. Charles Stutzenbaker, still alive. He was Texas's first 100% waterfowl biologist, 1956, with the precursors to TPWD. I interviewed old timers who said they saw it, but he said that snow geese would would fly straight down from Hudson Bay, Arctic Circle to Texas, because there was nothing in between. There were no reservoirs, no water, no, nothing for agriculture, just plains grasses. And at least until as late as the 1900s, people would talk about white geese that would fly all the way down here and simply fall out. You could pick them up. Some of them were dead. It was a 1,000-mile journey, and they made it straight.
Wow.
That's
No food
crazy.
in between.
That's
It's not
wild.
like that anymore. Those old white geese are smart.
Yeah, they are.
They get shot at all the way from Canada to Texas.
Yep.
Yeah, that's interesting, man, because you wonder what would trigger that. Like, because you would think that it seems like a hard like trait of a evolution of a species to really have, right? Because I'm sure they're always at risk of predation, and it's just crazy to imagine that would have lasted very long in the gene pool. Let's say the ones that couldn't, that you could pick up, but I guess the numbers were so high. It's like, yeah, and they were so concentrated. I could see how that would happen.
So the Stetson Baker estimated that about the turn of the century, there was no more than 1 million white geese. And they predominantly, this is the lesser snow geese, predominantly their wintering grounds were Texas and Louisiana. That was it.
Now you only kind of in your book, you in your books, you only kind of focused on Texas, right? You didn't talk to anybody from Arkansas or Louisiana,
No, see, those states already had their books. We didn't have ours.
Okay.
Now, for the market hunting, I went in a little bit nationally to give a sense of Texas's place in the national market hunting, but in the sport hunting, no, it was purely Texas, and I still had to weed out a couple 100,000 words.
Wow, man, yeah, that's a big project you did there.
It was.
Did they indicate, when you were talking to those folks, what the duck numbers were like back then? I talked to a lot of old timers, and these being guys in their 70s, the oldest probably in his 80s, and now these are long, born long after the people in your time, but they were talking, they're telling stories about the sky would be black with ducks, the duck hunting, they called it the good old days, and I always imagine that, but I can only imagine what it was like during the period you're writing about, the total numbers of birds, to sustain market hunting for that long just had to be incredible.
So the carrier, Hayden, was this ridiculous habitat. So, it's an age-old balance, which was going to have the bigger impact quickest, the gun or habitat destruction. And it was both, but Texas habitat was world-class, and we've done everything possible to destroy it. So both things working together. Nobody counted ducks. And as you say, the only thing they could say was, I couldn't see the sun.
Yeah.
But I did get some numbers. So, and the only way I got numbers was just by inference. So at the peak market hunting years, we only exported 2 birds, but 2 ducks, redhead and canvasback. That's all we exported. So at its peak, mid 1890s, Texas exported somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 canvasbacks and redheads
a year,
every season. Now let's look at the fact that all the other birds, which we consider darn good eating birds, pintails, mallards, mottle ducks. Now let's look at the local marketplace. I mean, 1 million, 2 million. That's what was harvested, and it was largely sustainable until we started combining the technology of repeating firearms with the technology of the gasoline engine. I mean, let's face it, if you've got to sail out for 2 or 3 days to go to your duck hunting spot, it's a little harder to convince yourself to do that in cold weather than just to get in a nice boat with a motor and head out there.
Yeah.
So you combine the technological advancements with the destruction of habitat, and with it, duck food. Those numbers just started spiraling down by 1930s, combined with a drought in the breeding grounds. We went from a time of plenty to a time of great worry about wiping several species of waterfowl out altogether.
Right. Now you said they exported that many ducks per season. So did they actually had a season back then that they abided by?
Yeah, it was from the first time the ducks got here until the last day they left.
Yeah, that's what I figured,
Yeah.
like winter, the season.
Yes, but they prefer to shoot spring, which I found really interesting. Market gunners really didn't wind in till about Thanksgiving, and they certainly didn't wind down until kind of end of March period. Some of that may have been that it was expensive to have ice on boats, and you had to get a good product to market, so you had to have coolish weather.
Man, that's incredible. They had to sail those ducks all the way up there to, New York. But now these market hunters, I imagine these people came from all over the country to come down to Texas to hunt.
That's a great point. But they didn't do it till late. So it's kind of like the world discovered Texas after they kind of reduced the numbers on their own flyways. Texas was it. So it was all Texas market hunters until about 1895. And then these commission market hunters started coming in. They brought railroad cars of ammunition. They brought railroad cars of refrigeration. Hunters that had no particular ties to their community. They followed the birds from Canada down to Texas, and they sold Texas waterfowl all across the world.
That's pretty cool. Have you found any like journals or anything like that from a market hunter?
Extraordinarily rare in Texas. So another great question, Hayden. So if you look at my neighbor, he started interviewing market hunters and grew up with market hunters in the 1940s, 50s, 60s on the Chesapeake Bay, and he had the ability to collect punting guns and sink boxes. Well, so Texas and Louisiana, but Texas in particular, between our river floods and our hurricanes, tremendous amount of destruction of our artifacts. So I would get a lead on where an old hunting skiff would be or a sink box, and oh, that was gone in hurricane fill in the blank. People's photograph albums, people's journals, their diaries, lost. The few that might have kept them, if you think about it, you go back 123 years or more, it was no big deal. It's how we made our living. We made our living hauling oysters, netting fish, and shooting ducks. What's the big deal? Why write it down? Why talk about it? It was no big deal. Very few newspapers carried the accounts of market hunters throughout the winters, and that's about all we get. There was one market hunter who put a chapter in a book that we've all relied on. When I say all the writers who want to get a sense of canvasback shooting at Lake Surprise will read Forrest McNair's biography, one good chapter on it, and that's it. It's hard information to find.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah.
So
Somebody somewhere's got one sitting in an attic or a chest somewhere.
Well, come on, Hayden, let's find it.
Somebody's got one. Somebody's great grandson's got it.
I found one or two out of Louisiana, which I have, but I don't write about Louisiana. Still haven't found one for Texas.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was a lot of work on these books. Is that so? Writing in itself, I know you and I had spoke on the phone a couple days ago. Is this a service you offer? And it's, I guess, if you want to talk about any of your current projects.
So one thing I learned quickly was you don't write to ever make money. I think right about now, after a decade, I'm starting to break even on the 2 books with A&M. There's no money in it, but it's a great hobby. It's a great thing. I've started writing some articles now for Project Upland magazine. They've branched out from Upland into more waterfowl and history, and what a great media group they are. I write for Clay Target Nation magazine. Finished that Tarpon Club book, but I've been fortunate that I guess the duck books have led to meeting some folks who own big old land in Texas and Louisiana, and they've asked me to, well, gee, give me a limited edition, give me a 100-volume printing of the history of my family and my property, and that's been fun, and you can almost charge minimum wage per hour to write that for them. It's contract writing, and I'm doing a couple of those now.
That's really cool.
Yeah, like I've always known about, I guess the older guys like Cowens and then the guy now it's Chance Yarbrough. So it's cool to know that there's actually, you're the writing version of that. You do some of the writing version of that. If you want some of the history of your place written about, then come to RK Sawyer.
Yeah, that's been fun. And I was worried about it at first. The first time I was approached, it's like, well, shoot, you got 6,000 acres on the Colorado River. This ought to take about 2 weeks. And some of these projects have been startling with the history of the people who lived there and the activities. It's been surprising, and it's been refreshing.
You had one thing I wanted to ask about was, where were some of the most popular places in Texas for market hunting? I know you mentioned Port Aransas, past Port Aransas, but are there any other places that were, prolific where these people went and hunted?
So there were always birds at some time of the year or another. If there was water, there was food, there was ducks, geese, swans, cranes. Canvasback was the big driver for popularity. And like you mentioned, or we talked about, the commission hunters, Lake Surprise was held by syndicates. You couldn't sport hunter, they had fence riders. Lake Surprise in Chambers County was locked out to waterfowl hunters and run by the market hunters. Harbor Island was probably number 2. That was a little more fluid, if you will. The Bloodworth family was best known waterfowlers of that area. They had the big sink box operation. Hines Bay, it turns out, had a Vallisneria celery grass growth, and it held 10 to 20 canvasback market hunters. Those were the really big areas for the export business.
Okay. Yeah, so really no inland areas, mainly on the coast,
They were all market gunned at some time of the year. Just picture you're at home, you're 14 years old, and a whole bunch of sandhill cranes land on the cattle prairie next to your homestead. Well, you're gonna shoot as many as you can, and you're gonna load them in a wagon. You're gonna take them to Dallas or Waco or San Antonio, but nothing that was as organized and prolific as the canvasback shooting areas.
Wow. Yeah, they probably looked at all the other ducks and just passed them up, huh? Or they shoot them too.
They shot them for the local market,
Okay.
but the canvasback shooters, they wouldn't mess with them, because canvasbacks bring in the market hunter 4 to 8 times more money than pintail, mallard, or any other duck.
Those are kind of like the mallard purists today. The guys that only shoot mallards, right?
Exactly.
So Rob, you're not only an author. I know you ran a couple duck clubs, and with that responsibility, you also do some habitat management. Could you give us a little bit, like kind of a short resume on your experience with that?
Yeah, I guess I'm a lot like you boys. We don't just duck hunt. We absorb waterfowl hunting. I mean, what's one of the first things you do is you learn how to shoot. I mean, you go out, but then you work on your shooting. Next thing you do, you probably buy a dog. Next thing you do is you probably start to spread out and experience different kinds of waterfowl hunting. I decided to research it, write about it, kind of finish that. What's next? I was fascinated by duck food. If you ran an operation, hell, if you just had your own property, having duck food, whether you had to plant it or you knew how to grow it, was the difference between a C- kind of day and A+ kind of day. And I was fascinated. So I got the opportunity from Spread Oaks Ranch to do their outdoor management, which was kind of like being head guide sort of thing, but also being the habitat management, which means I had to go out and learn about duck food. So great new facet of waterfowl hunting. And I started out like most people, where I planted all kinds of stuff, and one that costs money. If it's a drought year, you've got a problem with what you plant. If it's a flood year, you've got a problem. But native aquatics and native seed base it can take whatever nature throws at it, meaning I learned to let nature do the work. And as a result, I inherited 30 units at Spread Oaks and managed to put just ridiculous calories on the ground for the birds. It made a huge difference. And it was neat seeing thousands and thousands of birds in areas where 4, 5, 6 years earlier, there might have been one or two. And knowing that's something you did to bring them in.
No doubt. You do a lot of moist soil then?
Yes.
That's what you were doing? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
But
kind of divided things up into two buckets, and then I learned I could merge them both.
yeah.
Started off with a unit being purely aquatic, which is a simple thing. Naiad really wants to grow, and ducks love it. And
Can
the
you
other,
talk? I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but can you talk about the promotion of that, the two different buckets? Can you tell us about them and how you promote them?
yeah, Naiad's the simplest, and you could work that in with any rice farm. Because native seagrasses are kind of the enemy of the rice farmer, let's say. And an awful lot of Texas folks still have rice farming areas that they hunt, but it's really quite simple. What we do is disc a unit and then put water on it really fast. And surprisingly, I mean, I know I've read seed banks are supposed to last 20, 30 years. Well, we've disc areas that haven't been in duck ponds in 50 years, 75 years, and they immediately come up in Naiad as soon as you disc them and add water fast. That's all it takes. Disc and add water fast, and do it June, July, August, September, October. Pretty forgiving. Now it's a monoculture. Naiad's a great carb and a little bit of protein in the seed. I like diversity, so I'll throw in some other stuff, but Naiad's the simplest thing to do. If you don't have it in a unit for some reason or another, it's pretty simple to go borrow it from another unit, throw it in, and you'll have it. You've got to work hard to kill it. The native seeds are pretty similar. You got to watch in not so much invasives, but things that grow that you don't want. But we try to make sure that what we grow are native seed grasses, native seed crops like smartweed and jungle rice and a host of others, and get them to seed at the right time, add water at the right time, and you're looking at something that's as good or better than millet that you've planted, or even in some cases corn. Then when you can mix both together in the same unit, leaving some of that stalk that's rotting by January as an invertebrate factory, you spent $0 other than disking, and you've got a banquet that'll last you from teal season till the time the birds move on to Canada.
Yeah.
Just great fun putting all that together.
And it's cheap, right? It's just a little diesel and water versus planting corn or millet. We plant a lot of crops at our duck club, and that's one thing we talked about on a podcast a week or two ago about, this year we're probably just going to more natural stuff, because we found this year that the birds, they just prefer, it seemed like they preferred the natural stuff over the corn and the milo. They used it for thermal cover. You'd see birds in there on a windy day, or they'd be loafing, resting in there. But as far as feeding, they were in the, just take a bean field or a rice field that had been harvested, just flood it, put as much water on it as you can, as much water as you can afford, and they were in there, so that's something I agree with you. We got some properties on the Texas Prairie, Glade, Garwood we hunt, and that are in rice, or one, they're in a rotation. And so when they're not in a rotation, that's something that's really easy to do is moist soil. It's fairly easy and cheap, to do. So
yes, it is. And you can take those same units and you can throw some naiad in there, and that seed will come back year after year. So naiad is something that the rice farmer has no objection to at all. But usually their processes prevent it from coming back unless you give it a little helping hand. But you don't go buy it. You just trade somebody like me a couple of stout beers for a bucket full of naiad, and you're good to go.
what about wine? I know somebody that makes wine.
No, it's got to be stout beer.
Okay.
Rob, I learned Rob likes to be bribed with flounder.
Oh, I know somebody that can catch flounder too.
Yeah, flounder and stout beer pretty much will work for both.
All right.
So-
We'll have to have you come out to Garwood sometime and check it out, visit, show you around some of those places.
Yeah, I'd love to. I hunted Garwood. Gosh, it's been 20 years ago, but I had a lease there. Couldn't even remember how to describe it to you, but I can show you on a map. And there were gravel pits nearby. I hunted those a little bit. You probably know those famous old gravel pits. And I was on the edge of some of the lair land, which gives you about a 10-mile radius.
Yeah, probably close to Altair.
Yes.
Yeah, the duck hunting back then was probably really good. That 20 years ago, that's when I started duck hunting, was about 20 years ago, but I didn't really hunt Garwood too much. I didn't start hunting Garwood till around like 2005, 2000, no, it would be, yeah, about 2005. And it was pretty good. It was a lot better back then than it is now. There's just so many people hunting now, so much pressure,
It's hard to hear that.
yeah, but
Part of that pressure is coming in the way of solar panels as well.
yes, yeah, they're
Jimmy-
moving in there. They're
Yeah,
moving.
that was, Jimmy Reel's great roost from the 1950s. They called it the Benches, and it was associated with his very first Garwood hunting club.
I know exactly where that is.
Yeah, that was one of the best goose roosts in the state of Texas, and I don't want to go see it now covered in solar panels.
Yep, I know exactly where that is.
So last year, Hayden and a couple of our buddies from Mississippi started the Refuge Duck Club. And I know Hayden and I became friends in college, and he started South Texas Hunting Outfitters, and he's done a good job at that. And I feel like he's got the whitetail and exotic stuff figured out pretty good. But this year at the Refuge Duck Club, it seemed like I got to be there for about 8 days or so, but it seemed like there was a lot of lesson learning this first year. So I was wondering if you had anything to share about what do you feel are one of them, or let's say the top important aspects to running a successful duck club.
Well, the obvious answer, one everybody's going to give you, is waterfowl. You better have birds, you better have numbers.
Yeah.
But it really is a deeper question than that. Look at the clubs that have survived. There's some in Texas that they're over 100 years old. What else is different? Obviously, I was always big on communication. So what are our rules? Do you know them? Because they're important, not just for you, but for the other members. And then I thought more about it. And develop a culture. So if your culture in your duck club is drinking and gambling and card playing and staying up all night, go with it. Don't try to be anything else. Those clubs have made it forever. If your club is a duck hunters club, where guys, we're in bed at 9, it may bore the shit out of you, but we're in bed at 9. Quiet down, because these boys are going to be up at 3:30 and they're going to be doing what you all do. I got a long way to go in the morning because I want to hunt ducks.
Yeah.
You're a duck hunters club. Make sure everybody knows it. Try to maintain that culture amongst your membership. So to me, culture's a big part of the success of a club. Don't try to be everything. Promote the culture that you want and make sure others believe in it.
Yeah, we got a good club, man. It's 2 other guys, myself and the people that own the land, and we just bring our family and friends, and it's a lot of property in 3 different areas that are really good and established. A lot of ducks have imprinted there over the years, and we're just building on it, making it better every year without going broke, because you can, for example, like there's one place we hunt in Texas, and me and 3 other buddies lease it, and it's just a 200-acre property. And today one of them was like, hey, let's just flood the whole 200 acres. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And then I thought about it. I was like, oh man, how much is that going to cost, to flood 200 acres? So that's the balance. That's the hard part I have, because, ducks are up there on my priority list, and Clayton too. We think about them all year, and I have to hold myself back sometimes, because it's, people think deer hunting is expensive, and I guide deer hunts for a living. Deer hunting doesn't touch waterfowl hunting, when it comes to doing it right. A lot of people that aren't duck hunters, they just don't understand,
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny. You asked me the question, and I said nothing about finances, budget, and cost. That shows where my heart is.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes, when I looked at a club I worked with ages ago, they knew each year how many units they were going to flood, what that water cost, and they knew basically what their expenses were, and they just brought the number of members in that they needed to cover that cost plus their profit. They were extremely good businessmen, and that was obviously a really important aspect of it. It's nothing worse than at the end of the year going, oops, this was on me, and I lost $20,000, $30,000. You won't stay in business long.
No doubt.
I think your point about the culture and rules is a good one, and it's probably one that's overlooked, really. I've worked in, I know you did as well. You were probably more office, you were an operations geologist, is that correct?
Well, I was all kinds of a geologist, but my favorite part of it was the new ventures overseas field geologist. But yeah, I had to do
Okay.
the operations piece a bit as well.
So my closest thing that I could relate to that, because my duck hunting has just been small trips and we stay in a hotel, but is the closest thing I can relate to it is staying on the rig with, sharing a living area with guys. And there was some unspoken rules, but there's really not, we didn't, and I know that the bigger offshore rigs are a little bit different, but we never really had any rules. It was just if you did something kind of out of line and that somebody would call you on it. But that was one of the things I noticed at the duck club too. It's like, if you don't, being out at the refuge, it's like, if you don't have rules visible for everybody to see and they don't know what they are, then you can't really get on to anybody for doing something that, is out of the ordinary. Cause it's like, that's how they do it. And their way works for them. Right. And so it's like, but then, it's like, if you're all going to share that area together, there definitely needs to be that many people. There has to be some kind of rules, because it just makes it's frustrating for everybody. Most people probably think about it from their perspective, from their own perspective, and they're getting frustrated. They're not even thinking that the other guy's probably frustrated just as much about the way that you're doing it, right? And so it's like, if you have some kind of rules just written out there for everybody to see, it's like kind of the binding contract, if you will. Hey, I read these rules and this is the way we're going to do that, and I'm going to respect it. And it's like, hopefully that's as far as it has to go, and you avoid way more frustrations for everybody than anything.
Yes, and you look at some of the old clubs, Eagle Lake Rod and Gun Club, 1921, so 100 years. They still have copies of a 100-year-old rule book, guidebook, just guidelines to get along. Let's see, I was trying to think of another one that I saw recently, but 100 years of duck club guidelines. Oh yeah, it was the Tarpon Club. So that was 1897, where they wrote an entire rule book of guidelines. Sounds offensive and horrible, but if you want to stay in business, because it is a business, it's helpful.
Oh yeah. It's like the guidelines for any kind of relationship I'm learning, even if it's not officially written down, even I'm learning that about, interpersonal relationships as well. It's like, it just goes back to even sports, playing sports as a kid. It's like, how fun would a game of baseball be if we didn't know the same rules? It's like, right. No, that's an out. No, it's not. An out is this. It's like, man, it's
good analogy.
You think about those books, and it's not really, as humans, I feel like, I truly believe that we can make anything happen. Like I've learned that time and time again. When I was younger, I didn't necessarily believe that. It was probably kind of odd for a younger kid, right? When anything's possible through the power of Disney. But, now it's like, as I've gotten older, I truly believe that. So it's like, if you have a group of smart guys who are respectable human beings, it's like, it could last forever, right? It's like, I guess you think about like the Constitution, right? And how powerful of a document that is, right? And why it was so important, because people really got down to the nitty gritty and agreed on some concepts that, people could really stand behind and stay behind for generations.
Yeah, that's a great point. So duck clubs that survive more than one generation are rare, and what makes them tick, and the documents are certainly a part of that.
That's pretty deep. That's really deep.
No doubt. Yeah.
Well, Rob, I know your last season, you were still running the Spread Oaks Duck Club. I wanted to pick your brain about how that went. I know when we spoke a little bit about this on the phone, and it was very obvious to me that you did your due diligence as a manager there to take some detailed notes about, the harvest numbers and stuff like that. And you brought up some really interesting things that I didn't think about prior to our conversation related to, maybe some shifts in the migration. If we could talk about that.
Yeah, you bet. So last year, first off, I'm not advertising because I'm mostly retired from Spread Oaks now, helping a little bit with habitat, but moving over to other habitat projects for other hunting clubs and people have personal leases. But we just had a ton of birds. Now, I'd like to take credit for that, and maybe part of that is credit I could have. But when we really looked at the species, the distribution, we at Spread Oaks on that part of the Colorado River near Bay City with our inland kind of lower prairie units never shot a ton of widgeon. They were coastal birds, but as most people know, they're really kind of in that area between College Station and Waco with all that 1.1 million farm ponds. That's widgeon country. Every one of those little farm ponds holds 15 widgeon. It's a lot of widgeon. Well, all of that was dry this year. So we had a massive drought all up and down the Central Flyway. And I talked to my friends who had their farm ponds. If they weren't bone dry, they were certainly without duck food. We got all their widgeons on the Texas coast. Talked to anybody from Rockport to Sabine, and they were shooting widgeon numbers like they hadn't seen in 25 years. The good old days, a lot more gadwall. So what we got this year on the Texas coast, as long as you were a reasonable habitat manager, you had some food and some water, you had a devil of a lot of ducks. And in my opinion, I'm not a scientist, but that was at the expense of further up the Central Flyway and the impact and effects of the drought.
So what were some specific numbers that you saw? I know you said, what did y'all shot for numbers of widgeon in the past, and then what did y'all take this year or this past season?
I think we would typically shoot 6 to 12 widgeon this year out of probably 60 to 70 hunts. Well, sorry, not hunts, but days times 3 groups. Probably for most of that time period, a quarter to half of every limit was a widgeon limit.
Well,
so that's a lot of birds.
How was y'all's teal season out there, Rob?
It makes us look like heroes. What we do there is all our jungle rice. So we just flood our jungle rice compartments. We have a peak seed development. I care not to put a number on the amount of birds that we see, but the folks that have been out there put 20 to 40,000 kind of numbers on our 6,000 acres, which is way more than I can count.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, that area is, I think from that Gar or from that Eagle Lake to the coast, right? It's just the teal mecca, that's why I asked. I mean, you're in a prime spot for it.
Yes, we historically the last 10, 15 years have kept teal year round. I mean, you may remember the days when everybody expected the blue wings to leave at the end of Thanksgiving from the Texas coast and come back the last week or so in January. And more they've been staying. And this year was curious. It's kind of like the teal left, God knows where they went, but we were okay with that after teal season because they were replaced with widgeon, gadwall, and more mallards than we'd seen in many years.
Yeah, we shot a lot of teal this year during big duck season till probably till Thanksgiving. They stayed a while. Thank God for teal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was it was definitely interesting. I know this year, or not too long after when Hayden and I started hanging out, the river was hot, right? Like the Colorado. And I remember that kind of being similar circumstances where the lower Colorado River Authority wasn't allowing the release of water. And that meant if you had water, there was, you just absolutely slaughtered them. And then if the river was hot, and then we started to see that same thing this year. And I think one of the ways you mentioned it on the phone a couple of days ago was like, it just made the Texas prairie hunter look like the best duck hunters ever, right?
That's right. Yeah, no kidding. I listened to an awful lot of folks who thought that they were really great duck hunters, and good for 'em. I mean, you want the optimism, you want the success, because you want them coming back.
Absolutely.
Now when we get to a flood year, when Central Flyway is holding birds from literally northern Colorado, and the Dakotas holding those till Christmas, and they're not coming down. Oh, that's when we're going to find out who the really good duck hunters are.
Right. Who thought it ahead a ways. That's why I'm really passionate about public hunting for sure. And I think as Hayden keeps telling me, he's expecting his third girl now, so he doesn't have the availability to move around as much, or when he does, he wants to spend time with some of his hunting buddies that probably aren't willing to go on the adventures. But yeah, that's the very reason. That's the thing I started to notice. It was like the first duck lease I got on was with Corey and his dad, and it was near Anahuac, and it was like there was either birds or there wasn't birds, right? And then you're just still sitting there. It's like, what do you do at that point? Do you go sit out in the blind and just hope for the best? Well, let me just say one thing that I know a lot of people will disagree with, and it's the statement that people say where it's like the best day of hunting is better than the worst day at work. And I'm like, I don't agree with that at all. Like, I would much rather be putting money in my pocket than go sink in knee-deep mud and, tear an ACL or something, like, and shoot no ducks. And, I don't know. That's me though, but I understand other people are different. But yeah, that kind of really focusing on, and we'll continue to focus on it at least in the short term, but I'm just mark out days on a calendar. If I have 8 days, then it's 8 days, and then I'm going to come up with a plan and then a few contingencies, and then just go off of that. When it's a week out, then I start looking, and what's the migration looking like? How's the weather been? Using all kinds of other tools that I like to use. Lake levels are very an interesting one. I've noticed that
put a lot of science and a lot of information together now that you never used to be able to. You're absolutely right.
Exactly. I like, one of my favorite things to look at for public hunting is the lake levels. I've never really mentioned that. I try to kind of I'm going to start being more open about things that used to be secrets, or, I say secret, like I'm sure other people have done that, but lake levels and that increase in levels since springtime is something that a metric that I'll use, that it's like if it's a low pressure area and the level is risen, it's going to hold some puddlers usually, and 9 times out of 10, it's been a successful way to find them anyways.
Nice.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Hayden, you have any more questions for Rob?
Man, I don't. I want to meet up with you though, Mr. Rob. Next time you're around that area, I'd like to hook up with you and show you some of that stuff. I think it'd be pretty
I'd love
cool.
to do that anytime at all. Like I said, I work for Flounder, Stout, and they're in duck season. I work for a duck hunt, so we got a lot in common.
All right, we'll do something for sure.
Good. Well, gentlemen, I'm really hoping for the best season 2 with Fowl Minds, and appreciate the time I spent with you. It's been a great interview.
Yeah.
Thanks for following us, Mr. Rob, supporting us. We appreciate it. Jumping on here with us.
Absolutely. And that's another thing I want to say too, which is kind of a weird, instead of telling you this over the phone on a podcast, just not only appreciate all that, also appreciate what you've done for Texas duck hunting. I think the words that were used, which were pretty good, it was something along the line as you brought Texas waterfowling history from exile. And as far as I can tell, it was pretty true. And you just did it right in the nick of time, right? I know a lot of those people you spoke to have since passed away. And these books that you wrote are going to be around for years and years to come. And then I think without that, you know, we wouldn't know our history. We wouldn't know a lot of it anyways. And so thank you for, you know, supporting us, and thank you for supporting Texas waterfowlers and waterfowlers alike.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate your words, Clayton, and look forward to the next time we visit.
Yes, sir. We need to go
Thank you.
shoot at the gun club or
Anytime.
something.
Come on.
Yep. All right.
Gentlemen, thanks again.
Yep, thanks.
Bye.